The crowd inside the T-Mobile Arena pulsed with an energy that could only come from the anticipation of a colossal fight. The lights, blinding and relentless, illuminated the octagon like an altar where sacrifices were made. Fans stood shoulder to shoulder, some in silent reverence, others screaming the names of their warriors, voices lost in the thunder of thousands. This was no ordinary night. This was UFC 313, and at its heart stood a moment in time that would alter the course of an entire division, a fight destined to be carved into the history of the sport. Magomed Ankalaev, the man often overlooked, the fighter dismissed as a mere grappler, the one labeled too technical to be exciting, was moments away from proving the world wrong. Across from him stood Alex Pereira, a man who walked like a god of war, whose fists had torn legends from their pedestals, who carried the aura of an executioner waiting for his next victim. Pereira had come to dominate, to extend his reign, to add another name to his kill list. But Ankalaev wasn't here to be another name. He wasn't here to be remembered as the guy Pereira beat. He was here to take everything. The world had already decided that this was Pereira's moment, that the Brazilian's rise was unstoppable. Ankalaev heard the whispers, the dismissals, the lack of faith. He had walked through fire to reach this point, yet still, they called him an underdog. He had crushed every obstacle in his path, yet still, they doubted. But he carried no bitterness. Doubt was a gift. It was the fuel that burned within him. It was the silent whisper that told him to go harder, push further, break the limits they set for him. And tonight, he would show them all. As the bell rang, the world held its breath. The first round was a battlefield of precision. Pereira, cold and calculating, launched strikes that had ended careers, but Ankalaev was a shadow, slipping just beyond reach, countering with a sharpness that sent ripples through the arena. Each movement was measured, each strike a message. Ankalaev wasn't here to survive. He was here to take the throne. The second round came, and the pace was a storm. Pereira, realizing he was not facing a man afraid of him, increased his intensity. Kicks like whiplash, fists that could crack bones, yet Ankalaev stood in the storm unwavering. He countered with his own power, forcing Pereira onto the back foot, forcing the champion to recognize something he had rarely felt in his career: hesitation. By the third, the whispers of doubt that had followed Ankalaev into this fight had begun to shift. The crowd, once expecting another Pereira highlight reel, now found themselves witnessing something else entirely. Ankalaev wasn't just standing his ground. He was taking over. His strikes were landing with force that made even the most hardened fight fans flinch. His control was suffocating, his rhythm unstoppable. And in that moment, the realization began to settle in the reign of Pereira was in peril. The championship rounds were a war. Pereira fought like a man unwilling to let go of his kingdom, unleashing power that could shatter any opponent. But Ankalaev had walked too far to let this slip. He absorbed it. He endured it. He pushed forward when others would have crumbled. And when the final bell rang, the world was silent. The verdict was read, and in that instant, the course of history shifted. Magomed Ankalaev had done it. He had taken down the most feared man in the division, had silenced the critics, had claimed what was his. Dana White wrapped the championship belt around his waist, and the image of that moment spread like wildfire across the globe. But what no one expected was just how quickly it would shatter records. Within hours, the clip of Ankalaev's coronation had racked up millions of views. By the next day, it had surpassed the numbers of Islam Makhachev, the reigning lightweight king. 2 days, it was the most watched championship crowning moment in UFC history, accumulating over 26.8 million views. It was no longer a question of whether Ankalaev was worthy. He had become undeniable. But there was no time to revel in victory. Even as he stood on the highest peak of his career, negotiations were already beginning. The whispers of an immediate rematch loomed over him like a storm cloud. Dana White, never one to let controversy rest, suggested that Pereira deserved a chance to reclaim his throne. And so, just as quickly as he had risen, Ankalaev found himself staring down the next war. The celebrations in Dagestan were unlike anything seen before. A hero had returned home, a man who had climbed the impossible mountain and stood at the summit. Crowds flooded the streets, chanting his name. Fireworks lit the sky, and the echoes of his triumph reached every corner of the land. But amid the euphoria, Ankalaev's mind was already moving forward. He had won the battle. But the war had only begun. The night of Magomed Ankalaev's triumph had barely settled before the rumblings of war began again. While he stood in Dagestan as a champion, parades of people flooding the streets in celebration, banners bearing his name unfurling from the rooftops, and the voices of an entire nation chanting in unison, the storm of the MMA world was already forming. There was no peace at the top, only the echoes of challenges waiting to be answered, the whispers of those who refused to let a new king rule without a fight. And the loudest whisper of them all came from Alex Pereira, the fallen champion, who was already sharpening his blades for vengeance. Pereira was a man who had never needed words to send a message. His fists spoke for him. They had ended reigns, shattered legacies, and built an empire of their own. But now, those same fists had failed him against Ankalaev. It was an uncharacteristic night, a fight where his usual confidence had wavered, where his striking, so precise and brutal, had not found its mark as it always had. As he sat in the darkness of his training room, replaying the fight in his mind over and over, he felt something unfamiliar frustration. He knew Ankalaev had been the better man that night, but in the pit of his soul, he refused to believe that the story ended there. He hadn't lost his throne, he had only loaned it out. And now, with the UFC already stirring the pot of an immediate rematch, he saw his path back to power clearly. No excuses. No delays. The belt was his, and he was coming to take it back. Meanwhile, in the UFC's headquarters, Dana White was already laying the groundwork for what could be one of the biggest rematches in light heavyweight history. The numbers didn't lie, and Ankalaev's victory had shattered records, but controversy still hung in the air. Many believed Pereira had been caught off guard, that he had underestimated the challenge before him. Others speculated that perhaps the weight cut had drained him more than he had let on, that his body had betrayed him just when he needed it the most. Whatever the case, the demand for a rematch was already echoing through the MMA world. Ankalaev, however, was unmoved by the noise. He had earned this belt. He had fought through hell to get here. The idea of immediately granting Pereira a second chance felt like an insult, like the world was trying to rob him of the moment he had bled for. But he was not a man who ran from challenges. If they wanted him to prove himself again, he would do it. If the world still questioned whether he deserved this throne, he would answer in the only way he knew how, with his fists. His team had barely begun celebrating when the call came through. The UFC wanted him back in training camp. The rematch was in discussion. The war would happen sooner than anyone expected. But there was another element brewing beneath the surface, something neither man had fully prepared for. The UFC's matchmaking team was notorious for playing chess while the fighters played checkers. They saw more than just the next fight. They saw the bigger picture, the future of the division. And lurking just beyond the horizon was a potential disruptor. A name that could throw the entire rematch into question. Jiří Procházka, the former champion, a wild and unpredictable force, had been waiting in the shadows, watching as Pereira and Ankalaev battled for the throne he once held. He had been sidelined, forced to watch others lay claim to what had once been his. But now, with the division in flux, he saw his moment approaching. If the rematch faltered, if negotiations stalled, if injuries delayed the inevitable, he was ready to step in and stake his claim. And he wasn't the only one. Jamahal Hill, the man who had also worn the belt for a brief time before injuries derailed his momentum, was lurking as well. He had been vocal about his desire to return, about his belief that he was the true champion. The light heavyweight division, which had seemed so stable under Pereira, was now a battlefield with warriors waiting at every corner, each one hungry for the crown. Ankalaev knew this. He could feel the weight of the division pressing down on him, the knowledge that there would be no easy road ahead. He had barely won the belt, and already the vultures were circling. But he welcomed it. This was what he had fought for. This was what he had sacrificed everything for. The doubt, the challenges, the endless wave of opponents, this was the burden of the champion. And he would carry it with pride. As he stepped back into his training camp, the celebrations now nothing more than a memory, he felt the fire reigniting inside him. Pereira wanted revenge. The world wanted proof. The division wanted war. And Ankalaev was ready to give them all exactly what they asked for. As the news of a potential rematch between Magomed Ankalaev and Alex Pereira spread like wildfire, the MMA world found itself split into two camps, those who believed Ankalaev's victory was decisive, that he had truly exposed Pereira, and those who saw it as nothing more than an off night for the former champion, a fluke that needed to be corrected. But beneath all the debates, the social media storms, and the expert analyses, there was an unshakable truth that neither man could escape. The rematch would be a war unlike any other. For Pereira, the loss had been more than just a defeat. It had been a moment of reckoning. He had walked into that octagon with the confidence of a warrior who had faced the best strikers in the world and broken them. He had been the boogeyman, the nightmare of the light heavyweight division, the man whose fists carried the weight of destruction. And yet, on that night, against Ankalaev, he had found himself being outworked, outmaneuvered, and outclassed in ways he had never experienced before. But now, as he sat alone in the dimly lit corners of his gym, sweat dripping from his brow, his fists wrapped tightly, he felt something stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the hunger to prove himself again, to remind the world who he was. He didn't need to talk. He didn't need to make excuses. He only needed to fight. On the other side of the world, Ankalaev was already deep into his own preparations. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the criticisms. Some had called his victory unimpressive, claiming he had merely survived rather than dominated. He had been accused of playing it safe, of not fully taking the fight to Pereira the way many had expected him to. But he didn't care about opinions. He had walked into that cage and left as champion. That was all that mattered. Yet, even he knew that the rematch would not be the same as the first fight. Pereira would come back stronger, sharper, more dangerous. He wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. And that meant Ankalaev had to evolve as well. If the first fight had been a battle of strategy, The second would be a test of who could break the other first. And in that kind of war, there could be no hesitation. No second guessing. It would be a fight for survival. As both men trained in their respective camps, the UFC worked behind the scenes, pulling the strings, setting the stage for what was shaping up to be one of the most anticipated rematches in recent memory. But Dana White and his team knew that the fight alone wasn't enough. They had to make it bigger. They had to make it feel like the defining moment of the division. And so, as the negotiations continued, a new idea began to take shape. What if they didn't just run it back? What if they did something even bigger? What if they made this fight the headliner of one of the biggest cards of the year, stacked with names that would shake the very foundation of the UFC? They reached out to Prochazka. They reached out to Hill. They even floated the idea of a #1 contender fight alongside the rematch, setting the stage for whoever would be next in line. The light heavyweight division, once ruled by a dominant champion, had now become a battleground where every warrior wanted a piece of the throne. But at the center of it all, two men stood facing each other once again. Pereira, the fallen king, seeking to reclaim his empire. Ankalaev, the new ruler, determined to prove that his reign was no accident. The fight was inevitable. The war had already begun. And when the cage door closed, only one of them would walk out as champion. As the announcement loomed, the MMA world braced itself for what was certain to be one of the most highly charged rematches in recent history. The first fight had left questions unanswered, doubts lingering, and now the stakes were even higher. For Pereira, this was about redemption, about proving that his loss had been nothing more than an aberration, a night where things hadn't gone his way. For Ankalaev, this was about validation, about silencing those who still questioned his legitimacy as champion. But above all else, for both men, this was about pride, about proving to themselves that they were the best. In Pereira's camp, the mood was intense, almost militant. Every training session was brutal, every sparring round a war. He had left no room for distractions. There were no cameras allowed, no media obligations, taken only the grueling, punishing work of preparing for battle. His coaches had gone back to the drawing board, analyzing every moment of the first fight. They had pinpointed the weaknesses, the areas where Pereira had faltered, the opportunities he had let slip through his fingers. The focus wasn't just on power. Pereira had that in abundance. No, this time it was about control. About precision. About ensuring that when the moment came, he wouldn't let Ankalaev off the hook. Behind closed doors, there was talk of a new strategy, an approach that would take away Ankalaev's advantages. Pereira was known for his striking, for his devastating power, but what if he flipped the script? What if he forced Ankalaev to fight his fight on different terms? There were whispers that Pereira had been working tirelessly on his takedown defense, that he had brought in elite grapplers, that he was preparing for a fight that wouldn't just be about standing and trading. He knew Ankalaev would expect him to come out aggressive, to push forward, to try and land the kill shot. But what if, instead, he waited? What if he forced Ankalaev to come to him, to make the first mistake? On the other side of the world, in Dagestan, Ankalaev was equally locked in, but his approach was different. Where Pereira trained with an air of vengeance, Ankalaev trained with quiet determination. There was no desperation in his camp, no sense of a man trying to prove something. To Ankalaev, he was already the champion. He had already won. And now, he simply needed to do it again. But even he knew that this fight would not be the same. Pereira was too smart, too dangerous to make the same mistakes twice. Ankalaev's team studied the Brazilian's habits, the small tells that gave away his intentions. They knew he would come in with a new game plan that he would have adjusted. And so, they adjusted too. They worked on speed, on angles, on conditioning. They prepared for a war that would go deep into the championship rounds. If Pereira wanted to test his limits, Ankalaev would take him there. If he wanted to turn this into a chess match, Ankalaev would show him that he was just as skilled, just as dangerous. As the fight neared, the UFC ramped up its promotion. The storylines wrote themselves. The rematch was more than just a title fight. It was a battle between two men from vastly different worlds, with vastly different styles, but with the same unyielding desire to be the best. The build-up was electric, with press conferences that crackled with tension. Pereira, always stoic, spoke little, his eyes revealing nothing. Ankalaev, equally reserved, remained calm, composed. The trash talk that fueled so many fights was absent here. This wasn't about words. This was about action. Fight week arrived, and the anticipation reached a fever pitch. The weigh-ins were a spectacle, the final face-off charged with an intensity that needed no words. Fans speculated endlessly, would Pereira's power be the difference maker? Would Ankalaev's strategy nullify it once again? Would this be another 5-round battle, or would one of them find the finish this time? And then, the night arrived. The arena was electric, a sea of fans roaring as the fighters made their way to the octagon. The energy was different from the first fight this time. It felt personal. The bell rang, and for 5 rounds, the world watched as 2 of the best fighters on the planet went to war. The rematch was everything it had promised to be. It was brutal, technical, relentless. Pereira fought like a man possessed, his striking more calculated, his movements sharper. He forced Ankalaev into deeper waters than before, tested his chin, his heart. But Ankalaev was prepared. He absorbed the damage, countered with precision, executed his game plan with near-perfect efficiency. Each round was razor-thin, every exchange a battle within the war. And then, in the championship rounds, the moment came. A single mistake, a lapse in defense, a perfectly timed strike. The sound of impact echoed through the arena, and in that instant, the fight was decided. As the dust settled, as one man lay on the canvas and the other stood victorious, the MMA world erupted. The rematch had delivered. It had answered every question, settled every debate. And when the referee raised the winner's hand, there was no doubt left. The war was over, and the division had its undisputed king.